I turned down a $340,000 job and moved back home to care for my dying father for 2 years. My brothers inherited everything and told me the sacrifice was my choice. 2 years of my career, my savings, and my life on hold to care for Dad while my brothers stayed comfortable. Then the will was read, and I got nothing. My name is Thomas Calloway. I'm 44 years old. 2 years ago, I turned down the best job offer of my career to move back home and care for my dying father. I gave up a promotion worth $340,000 a year. I resigned from a job I had spent 15 years building. I moved out of my apartment in Seattle and into my father's house in Clarksville, Tennessee, and I stayed there for 22 months. I managed his medications. I drove him to chemotherapy every other week. I cooked the specific foods his oncologist recommended. I coordinated with the hospice team. I sat with him through the nights when the pain was bad and the fear was worse. My 2 older brothers lived within 40 minutes of that house the entire time. They did not do any of those things. When my father died and the will was read, his estate was divided equally among the 3 of us. $160,000 each. My brother Richard looked at me across the table and said, "You chose to be there, Thomas. Nobody forced you. Dad loved us all equally, and the will reflects that." I have thought about those words nearly every day since. This is the story of what it costs to be the son who stayed. My father's name was Earl Calloway. He grew up in rural Tennessee, the youngest of 5 children, in a household where money was scarce and work was the answer to every problem. He joined the Army at 18, served for 6 years, came home, married my mother Patricia, and spent the next 30 years working as a machinist at a manufacturing plant outside Clarksville. He was not a man who talked about feelings. He expressed love through action, through showing up, through the specific, physical work of being present for the people he was responsible for. I am the youngest of 3 sons. Richard is 6 years older than me. Gary is 3 years older. I grew up as the little brother in the way that youngest children do, always slightly behind, always looking to catch up, always trying to prove I belonged at the same table as the older boys. My mother Patricia died of a stroke when I was 26. She died quickly, which the doctors said was a mercy. My father did not say much about it. He went quiet for about a year. Then he came back to himself, slowly, and I think he was never quite the same after, but he was recognizably Earl again. Working the yard, watching football, calling each of us on our birthdays. After Mom died, I moved to Seattle for work. Richard was already established in Clarksville with his insurance business. Gary had settled in Nashville with his wife Sandra and their 2 kids. We were a family that stayed in contact without being particularly close. Holiday gatherings, birthday calls, the occasional group text that nobody responded to quite enough. I built a career in software. I was good at it. I had a talent for systems architecture, for seeing how the large, complicated pieces of a technology infrastructure needed to fit together, identifying where the fragile points were before they became failures, designing systems that could carry more weight than they appeared capable of carrying. I worked my way up over 15 years from a junior developer at a small consulting firm to a senior architect role at a mid-sized technology company in Seattle. The progression was not glamorous or sudden. It was the result of 15 years of showing up early, staying late, saying yes to the difficult projects that other people passed on, and doing the unglamorous work of documentation and knowledge transfer that most developers considered beneath them, but that I understood was how institutions actually function and sustain themselves. My salary had grown steadily. My professional reputation was solid. I had a network of people in the industry who knew my work and trusted my judgment. I had been recruited twice in the previous 3 years by firms that wanted to hire me away, and both times I had negotiated better terms at my current company rather than leave, because I had built something there and I wanted to see it through. The work also gave me a life I was genuinely content with. I had an apartment in Capitol Hill with a view of the water on clear days. I had a group of friends, mostly people I had met through work or through the hiking club I joined when I moved to Seattle. I had Claire. When I was 42, my manager pulled me aside after a quarterly review and told me the company was creating a new vice president of architecture position. The role was designed around the exact work I had been doing informally for several years. Organizational and technical leadership that had been uncompensated, and that the company had finally decided needed a formal title and a budget that reflected its actual importance. I was the internal candidate they wanted. The VP of engineering had already told me, privately, that the decision had been made before the formal offer was constructed. The compensation package was $340,000 annually. Base salary of $210,000, a performance bonus structure that realistically paid out around $80,000 annually based on historical performance, and equity that vested over 4 years. I want to be specific about what this meant, not to make the story about money, but because the specifics are necessary for what comes later to make sense. $340,000 a year was the validation of 15 years of disciplined, unglamorous work. Every early morning, every difficult project, every time I chose the harder path. I told my manager I needed a few weeks to consider it. 3 days later, my father called. He had been feeling unwell for several months. Fatigue he attributed to age, some abdominal discomfort. He had finally seen a doctor, after repeated prompting from Richard, who lived closest and had noticed Dad was slower than usual at a family dinner. The diagnosis was stage 3 pancreatic cancer. I flew home that weekend. I sat in my father's kitchen, the same kitchen I had grown up in, with the same yellow curtains my mother had put up and my father had never changed, and I looked at him across the table. He was thinner than I had seen him. His color was off. He was holding the pamphlets the oncologist had given him with the careful attention of a man who has never been sick and is trying to understand a language he has never had to learn. "What do you need, Dad?" I asked. He looked at the pamphlets for a moment. "I don't know yet," he said. "I'll figure it out." That was Earl. He was going to figure it out. He was going to handle it the way he handled everything, through self-sufficient, stoic forward motion. But he was 71 years old, and he lived alone, and the treatment protocol was going to be aggressive, and the house needed things, and the appointments needed coordination, and someone needed to be there. I drove to Richard's office on a Monday morning. Richard has an insurance agency, a real, established business, 12 employees, a corner office in a building he owns. He is successful in the way that our father always hoped his sons would be. He shook my hand and offered me a seat and listened while I laid out what Dad was facing and what the care requirements were going to look like. "I know," Richard said. "Sandra and I have talked about it. It's a terrible situation. I'm going to make sure I get over there more. I'll check in on him regularly." "He needs more than checking in, Richard. He needs someone there. Someone managing the medical coordination and the medications and the daily care. I have a business to run, Thomas. 12 people depend on me. I can't just..." He gestured vaguely at the wall, as if the scope of his obligations was too large to specify. "I'll do what I can, but I can't restructure my whole life." I called Gary that evening. Gary is a project manager at a construction company. His wife, Sandra. I want to make sure I keep the names distinct here. Gary's wife is Lynette. Richard's wife is Sandra. Gary's wife, Lynette, is a woman who has always been pleasant to my face and has made it quietly known, over years of family gatherings, that she regards any obligation outside her immediate household as someone else's problem. "I talked to Gary," she told me, when Gary handed her the phone without apparent discussion. "And we agree that we have to be realistic about what we can offer. The kids are in school. Gary has his job. We can come on weekends sometimes. We can bring food. But I cannot have Gary be away from his family for extended periods." I did not ask her to define what an extended period was. I went back to Seattle. I called my manager and told him I needed to explore whether there was any possibility of a remote arrangement while I addressed a family medical situation. He was understanding, as managers say they are. We worked out an arrangement where I would work remotely for an initial period of 4 months. I listed my apartment on a short-term rental platform, packed what I needed, drove back to Clarksville. I want to be precise about what the following 22 months actually involve, because I think the word caregiving sometimes sits in people's minds as an abstraction, a general notion of being helpful and present, and the reality is something considerably more specific and considerably more demanding. Earl's chemotherapy protocol was every other week. Each session lasted between 4 and 6 hours. I drove him to the cancer center, sat with him through the infusion, drove him home, and then managed the 48 to 72 hours of nausea, fatigue, and discomfort that followed each session. I tracked the antiemetic medications, the corticosteroids, the blood pressure medications he had been on before the cancer diagnosis, and the new pain management regimen that was added as the disease progressed. I kept a spreadsheet. I updated it after every appointment. I brought printed copies to every oncology visit so the medical team had an accurate, current record. I cooked. Earl's oncologist had given us dietary guidelines: high protein, low fiber during certain treatment phases, specific restrictions around what his digestive system could handle at different points in the treatment cycle. I learned to cook differently than I had ever cooked. I was a functional bachelor cook before this: pasta, eggs, things that required minimal effort and appealed primarily to convenience. I became, out of necessity, someone who could prepare soft, high-calorie, nutritionally dense meals that an ill man with diminished appetite could be persuaded to eat. I learned which textures worked and which did not. I learned that Dad would eat chicken if it was very tender and in a light broth, but not if it was dry. I learned that scrambled eggs at 7 in the morning were one of the few things he consistently wanted. I made them every morning for 18 months. I managed the house, the yard, the minor repairs that accumulate in any home where the primary resident is no longer physically capable of addressing them. I fixed a leaking pipe under the kitchen sink. I had the roof inspected when a section looked concerning after a heavy rain and arranged for the repair before winter. I hired someone to cut the grass through the summer because Earl cared about the lawn even when he could barely walk to the window, and I wanted him to be able to look out and see it kept the way he had always kept it. That mattered to him. Maintaining the appearance of the home he had worked for and lived in for 40 years mattered to him in a way I did not fully understand until I was the one maintaining it. I also managed his finances, which had fallen into mild disorder during the months before his diagnosis, when he had been too unwell to stay on top of things, but not yet aware of why. I organized his accounts, set up automatic payments for his utilities and insurance, met with his financial advisor, made sure his affairs were in order in the way that a person's affairs need to be in order when they are facing a serious illness. I slept in the house, in my old bedroom, with the same furniture from when I was in high school. At night, particularly in the first year, I kept my door open so I could hear him. There were nights he needed water, or his medication timing was off, or he simply could not sleep and would sit in the kitchen, and I would hear him moving and get up and sit with him. We talked more, in those kitchen hours, than we had talked in the previous 20 years combined. Not about deep, dramatic things, mostly about ordinary things. About his Army years, which he had rarely discussed when we were growing up. About the plant where he had worked for 30 years and the men he had worked alongside, some of whom were still alive and would call occasionally. About my mother, whose absence was always present in that house, in the unchanged curtains and the photograph on the hall table, and the garden she had planted that Earl had maintained every spring because she would have wanted it maintained. He asked me once, around month 14, whether I resented being there. I told him no, and it was true. I did not resent being there. What I resented, though I did not say it to him, was being there alone. Richard visited at Thanksgiving. He came with Sandra and their 2 teenage daughters. They stayed 2 nights. He helped me with some heavier lifting around the house, a section of fence that needed resetting, some boxes in the garage that needed moving, which I genuinely appreciated. Physical help was physical help, and I was not going to dismiss it. He sat with Dad and watched football on the Thursday, and I could hear them talking in the way that fathers and sons talk when they are watching a game together. Not about anything, really, but also about everything. The conversation mostly beside the point of the presence. When he left on Saturday, he shook my hand at the front door and said, "I don't know how you do it, Tom." Really? I did not have an answer. I just did it because it needed doing. I told him that. He nodded and hugged me, briefly, and then drove away with his family in the car. I stood at the front door for a moment after they left. The house was quiet again in the specific way it was always quiet after company, a heavier quiet than before they arrived, because it was the same silence with the absence of people added to it. Dad was asleep by 8 that night. He was always tired after any sustained social interaction by that point in the treatment. I sat in the kitchen and cleaned up the dishes and thought about what Richard had said. I don't know how you do it. The answer, which I did not give him because I did not want it to become an argument on a holiday, was, you do it because someone has to, and you are here because you chose to be here, and I am here because I chose to be here too. And the difference is that you are going back to your life in Clarksville, and I am staying. Gary came for Christmas with Lynette and their 2 kids. They stayed one night. Lynette made a large casserole, something with rice and sausage that she had made for family gatherings as long as I had known her, a dish everyone complimented and no one could remember the name of. And it sat in the refrigerator for 4 days because it was too rich for Earl's system at that stage of treatment, and he could manage only small amounts of simple food. I did not say this to Lynette. I thanked her for bringing it and wrapped it carefully, and it fed me over several evenings. Gary took me aside on Christmas evening while the kids were in the other room, and Lynette was helping Earl through the hallway to his chair. He put a hand on my shoulder and told me he appreciated everything I was doing and that he wished he could do more. "You can do more," I said evenly. "I could use a break, even a week. You could come and stay for a week and I could go somewhere and not be responsible for anything for 7 days." He looked at the floor briefly. "I know, man. I know. It's just, the kids are in school and Lynette." "Gary, I understand. It's okay." It was not okay, but it was the situation, and I had, by that point, accepted that the situation was the situation. Getting upset about it in a kitchen on Christmas evening was not going to change what Gary was and was not capable of giving. It was just going to make Christmas worse and make him feel guilty enough to become defensive, and defensive Gary was less useful than guilty Gary. So I said it was okay, and I suppose some part of me meant it, and we went back into the living room, and Earl was in his chair watching the end of a Christmas special, and we all sat together in the soft light of a holiday in a house where everyone knew, without saying it out loud, that this was probably the last Christmas any of us would spend in that room together. We watched the television and said the things that people say at holidays, and did not say the other things. The year itself, the whole of it, had a rhythm I would not have been able to describe before living it. Chemotherapy weeks and recovery weeks. Good stretches and bad stretches. The early months of cautious optimism, when the tumor markers responded better than projected, and the oncologist used the word encouraging without qualification. The middle months of steady maintenance, when we had settled into the discipline of the regimen and Earl had accepted, with the stoic practicality of a man who had never been sick and had decided not to be dramatic about it now, that this was his life for the foreseeable future. And then the later months. Month 18, when the scan results were not what we had been working toward. When the oncologist used different words, manageable, comfort-focused, quality of life, and Earl sat across from her in the consultation room and listened with his hands on his knees and asked his questions with the same careful precision with which he had always approached a problem he needed to understand. On the drive home from that appointment, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I think we should call the hospice people." "Okay, Dad," I said. "You've done good, Thomas." It was the most direct acknowledgement he gave me during those 22 months. For words, he did not elaborate. He looked out the passenger window at the highway passing, and I looked at the road ahead, and we drove the rest of the way home in the silence of people who understood each other well enough to let those 4 words carry everything they needed to carry. My remote work arrangement collapsed at the 4-month mark. The company needed more from the vice president role than could be delivered remotely, and without me formally in that role, the position was being offered to the external candidate. I was offered a path to stay in my current senior architect role on a reduced remote schedule, but the honest conversation I had with my manager made clear that my career trajectory at that company had shifted. The VP opportunity had passed. The reduced remote arrangement was a courtesy, not a future. I submitted my resignation at month 5. I want to describe what that felt like because I think it matters. It did not feel heroic. It did not feel like a noble sacrifice that I would look back on with uncomplicated pride. It felt like closing a door that I had spent 15 years walking toward, and doing it in a kitchen in Clarksville, Tennessee, on a Tuesday afternoon while my father slept in the next room, and the chemotherapy poured in his chest was scheduled for its next use in 8 days. My hands were steady when I sent the email. I had written the letter over several days, revising it each morning, trying to find the right tone between professionalism and honesty. I thanked the company. I thanked my manager. I said it had been a privilege. I said I was stepping away for personal reasons. I did not use the word sacrifice in the letter because it was not a letter for that word. I closed the laptop and sat for a while. I thought about the VP offer. I thought about the equity vesting over 4 years that I would not have. I thought about the salary I had been within days of accepting, the largest compensation I had ever been offered, the result of 15 years of work, and I watched it become a data point in a past I was closing. Then I heard my father moving in the next room, and I got up and went to check on him. That was the right order of things. I knew that then, and I know it now. What I also knew, sitting in that kitchen after sending that resignation email, was that the choice I had just made was going to cost more than I could calculate in the moment, that the cost would continue to accrue after the caregiving ended, in ways I could not yet see. I made the choice anyway, because the alternative was to be Richard, or to be Gary, and whatever the price of choosing differently, the price of being that person, of standing on the bank, was one I was not willing to pay. I stayed, month after month. The seasons changed outside the yellow curtains my mother had put up, and my father had never changed. Dad had good stretches and bad stretches. There were months in the middle of the treatment where we dared to hope. His numbers improved. His energy came back partway. We had conversations at the kitchen table that felt almost normal. I let myself believe, for a period of about 3 months, that this might go differently than the statistics suggested. It did not go differently. In month 18, the oncologist told us the cancer had spread. The treatment approach shifted from curative intent to palliative management. I coordinated with the hospice team that came in to support us in the final months. I learned, from the hospice nurses who became the most matter-of-fact and genuinely helpful people in our lives during that period, what to expect, what the stages looked like, what I could do, and what was beyond anyone's ability to do. Richard and Gary came more frequently in the last 2 months. I will give them that. When it became clear that Dad was near the end, both of them made more effort. They were there, across the final week, in shifts. I was grateful for that. I want to say so plainly. But I had been there for 22 months. They had been there for, collectively, perhaps a dozen weekends. My father died on a Saturday morning in early spring. I was in the room. Richard and Gary arrived within the hour. We sat together in the living room for a long time without saying much. Then the practical machinery of death began. The funeral home, the death certificates, the notifications, the arrangements. I handled most of it because I knew where everything was, because I had been the one managing Dad's paperwork for nearly 2 years. The will was read 3 weeks after the funeral at the office of my father's attorney in Clarksville. I had not seen the will. Dad had never discussed it with me directly. I knew he had one. He had updated it after Mom died, 11 years before his diagnosis. I had assumed, without examining the assumption closely, that the 2 years I had given might be reflected somehow, that the will might acknowledge what the 3 of us had contributed differently. I sat in a chair across from my brothers and listened to the attorney read the document. Equal division, 1/3 each. The family home, the savings account, the investment accounts. $480,000 total. $160,000 to each son. I looked at the number on the page. I thought about the vice president offer. $340,000 a year. The career trajectory I had stepped off of. The 2 years of income one had not earned. The savings I had drawn down to cover my own expenses while I was not working. The apartment in Seattle I had given up. The professional relationships that had gone quiet over 22 months of absence from an industry that moves quickly. $160,000. I did not say anything during the reading. Not then. Afterward, in the parking lot, I raised it with Richard. I want to talk about the will, I said. What about it? Dad wrote it 11 years ago, before the diagnosis, before I moved back, before I spent 22 months as his full-time caregiver. I'm not saying I don't deserve my share. I'm saying the equal division doesn't account for what the 3 of us actually contributed. Richard looked at me with an expression that I recognized. He is 6 years older than me, and he has always had a particular way of looking at me that makes me feel like I am still 20 years old and making an argument he has already considered and already dismissed. Thomas, you chose to move back. Nobody told you to quit your job. Nobody asked you to do all of this. Someone had to, Richard. You and Gary made it clear you weren't going to. We contributed in other ways. We were there for Dad. We came. You came for holidays. I was there every day for 22 months. You chose that. Nobody forced you to make those choices. Dad loved us equally, and his will reflects that. End of story. Gary said less. He found me before he left the parking lot and put a hand on my shoulder and said, "Don't make this about money, Thomas. It was about being a good son. You were a good son. That has to be enough. That has to be enough." I drove back to the house. I sat in my father's kitchen. I looked at the yellow curtains. I thought about what my brothers had said and what they believed, or what they needed to believe, and whether there was any distinction between the two. I want to be honest about the anger I felt in the days and weeks that followed, because I think the only thing worse than the situation itself would be to pretend I processed it with grace I did not actually have. I was furious, not primarily about the money. Although the money was real and the disparity was real, and anyone who tells you that $160,000 adequately compensates a person for 2 years of full-time caregiving and a derailed career has not done the arithmetic. I was furious because of what Richard said. "You chose to be there, Thomas. Nobody forced you." That sentence has lived in me since the day he said it, and I have turned it over enough times that I think I now understand exactly what it means and what it is designed to do. It is designed to convert an ethical failure into a neutral fact. Because here is what is true. I did choose to be there. I made a choice, yes, but the choice existed within a specific context, a context in which my father was dying and needed full-time care, and neither of my brothers was willing to provide it. My choice was not made in a vacuum. It was made in response to their absence. When Richard says nobody forced me, he is technically correct. No one put a gun to my head. But he is using a narrow definition of force that conveniently excuses the pressure created by his own inaction. If you and I are both standing on a riverbank and a person is drowning and I jump in and you do not, and I later bring up that you didn't jump, and you say nobody forced you to jump, you are correct, technically. But you know what you did? You stood on the bank. I want to talk about what the 2 years cost that cannot be expressed in dollars, because the dollars are not actually the whole story, even though they are the clearest shorthand for what happened. I was 42 when I moved back to Clarksville. I was in a relationship at the time, a woman named Claire, who I had been seeing for 14 months and who I thought seriously about a future with. When I moved back to Tennessee and the remote work arrangement consumed whatever margin we had and my availability collapsed, we tried to maintain the relationship across the distance and the stress. By month 6, we had both acknowledged that what we were doing was not working. We ended it, amicably, the way two people end something when the circumstances overwhelm the connection rather than either person doing anything wrong. I think about Claire sometimes, not with bitterness toward my brothers or my father or anyone, just with the quiet recognition that the 22 months cost me something in that dimension too, and that dimension doesn't appear in any estate document. I am 44 now. I am back in Nashville, in a rental apartment, rebuilding. I found a new position, a good one, senior architect at a firm that was willing to hire someone returning to full-time work after a gap, but it is at a salary level roughly 40% below what the vice president role would have been. I am 2 years behind where I would have been. The professional relationships I had in Seattle have moved on, as professional relationships do when someone disappears from an industry for 2 years. I am not destitute. I want to be clear about that. I have my inheritance and my income and my skills. I will be fine in the practical sense of the word. But fine is not the same as where I was. And where I was is not the same as where I would have been. Richard and Gary each deposited their checks and went home. I do not know if they think about this the way I think about it. I have not spoken to Richard since the parking lot conversation after the will reading. Gary and I have exchanged a handful of texts, mostly around the logistics of selling the family home, which was the one task that required coordination among the three of us. The house sold. The proceeds were distributed equally, per the terms of the will. We exchanged formal, transactional messages through the process, and nothing more. I am trying to work out what I want from them now. Not from the estate. From them. I think what I want is for one of them, just once, to say clearly, what you did mattered. What you gave up was real. I saw it. I see you. Not a redistribution of funds that have already been distributed. Not a formal apology that would require either of them to become a different person than they are. Just acknowledgement. The simple, honest acknowledgement that the past 22 months were not equivalent contributions dressed in different styles. I do not think I am going to get it. Richard is not a man who revisits conclusions. He is a man who makes decisions and defends them and constructs the narrative that makes them feel right. And the narrative he has constructed about the estate is one where Dad loved all three sons equally, and the will expressed that love. End of story. To acknowledge the disparity would require him to examine his own choices during those 22 months, and Richard does not do that kind of examination. Not about things that cost him something. Gary is gentler, but gentler is not the same as braver. Gary is the kind of person who prefers comfort to clarity. He would rather tell me that it was about being a good son than reckon with the fact that he was not one, not in the way it counted. Lynette's preferences gave him permission to stay comfortable, and he took the permission that was offered. He is not going to walk back across that bridge. They have both returned to their lives, and their lives are arranged in ways that do not require them to spend any time looking at what they chose during those 22 months. I have spent considerable time looking at it. I want to be honest about something that I think matters for anyone listening who might find themselves in a similar position, either as the person who stayed or the person who didn't. For a period of several months after the estate was settled, perhaps 5 or 6 months, I was not well. Not dramatically, not in a way anyone around me would have named as a crisis. But I was flat in a way I had not been before, and I was angry in a way I was not managing effectively. And I was having a recurring experience of sitting down to do something and finding that I could not quite locate the energy to begin. I started seeing a therapist, a woman named Dr. Anita Ramsey in Nashville, who has been in practice for many years and who has a rubber plant in the corner of her office that she has clearly had for a very long time. Going to see her was not something I would have done before any of this. I was the kind of person who believed that the interior work of emotional management was something you did on your own, privately, without assistance. Capable people handled their difficulties through forward motion, not by sitting in someone's office and talking about their feelings. 2 years of caregiving followed by a parking lot conversation with Richard adjusted that belief considerably. What I worked through with Dr. Ramsey, over many sessions, was not primarily the money, though the money was part of it. It was the feeling of being unseen, of having given the most significant thing I had ever given and having it registered as a tie, of hearing my brother tell me, with complete confidence, that nobody had forced me to do what I did, as though the absence of a physical gun to my head was the same as the absence of compulsion. She asked me, at one point, whether I had ever said directly to my father, while he was alive and there was still time, that an updated will would matter to me. That formal recognition of the asymmetry would mean something. I had not. I had not said it because it felt transactional, because I did not want Earl, who was dying, to feel that I was performing a calculation, because the son he raised did not put his hand out while his father was in chemotherapy. I understand now that there was a middle ground available to me that I did not take. A direct, private conversation with my father at some point in those 22 months that did not have to be about money at all. That could simply have been, "Dad, I need you to know what this cost. And I need you to think about whether the will reflects the reality of what the three of us actually did." That conversation might have changed nothing. Earl might have kept the equal division for reasons of his own I will never fully know. Or it might have changed something. I did not have it. That is my part in this. Richard and Gary did not volunteer. That is their part. My father did not update the will. That is his part. And I say it with no bitterness toward a man who was spending his last years fighting a disease that eventually won, and who expressed love the way he had always expressed it, through action and presence and the small, daily work of being there, and who perhaps did not understand the document he left behind was going to do what it did to the family he was leaving. I think about the attorney's account often, that Earl had told him, in one of their last meetings, that he was grateful for what I had done, that he knew the cost, that he was proud of me. He said it to the attorney. He did not put it in the will. He did not find a way, in the time he had left, to make Richard and Gary hear it while there was still a living conversation to be had between three sons about what had actually taken place in that house, in that kitchen, during those 22 months. I know why. Because Earl was a man who carried the interior work quietly and assumed the people he loved could see it without being told. He learned that from a generation of men who were taught that expressing the work directly was somehow a weakness, somehow less dignified than just doing the thing and trusting that people knew. He trusted that people knew. Some of them did not. I chose to be there. Richard was right about that in the narrowest technical sense. But here is what I need to say. For anyone who has ever stood on the bank while a sibling jumped in and then told themselves it was just their choice, that the context had nothing to do with them. Choice does not exist in a vacuum. Every choice is made within a specific situation, and the situation is partly built by the people who made different choices. When you decline to show up, you are not a neutral absence. You are part of the circumstances that made someone else's choice necessary. You shaped what was available for that person to choose from. I chose to be there, and you chose not to be. And the 22 months that followed that fork are not equivalent experiences dressed differently. They are different realities that produced different costs and cannot be made equivalent by a will written 11 years before the situation that tested us. I am 44 years old. I am rebuilding. I get up every morning and go to work and do good work and come home and make something to eat and try to be present for the life that is actually in front of me rather than the one I would have had. I am doing it. I will be fine. I just want someone who was there, who stood on that bank and watched, to someday say plainly that they saw what happened and that they know it was not nothing. I hope that day comes. My father was a man who showed love through presence and action, through showing up, through the specific, physical, daily work of being there for the people who needed him. I know exactly where I learned it. I know whose example I was following during those 22 months in his kitchen, making eggs at 7 in the morning and sitting with him in the hours after midnight, and driving the same stretch of highway to the cancer center and back until there were no more drives left to take. His example was worth following. I believe that without reservation. I just wish it had been worth more, in the end, to the people who decided what he left behind. Have you ever been the sibling who gave up everything to care for a parent while others stayed comfortable from a distance? Have you ever been told that your sacrifice was simply your choice, as if the context that made the choice necessary had nothing to do with the people who weren't there? Have you ever watched a family divide an inheritance equally when the contributions were anything but equal? Share your story in the comments. Because choosing to show up is still a choice, and so is choosing not to. If you believe that standing on the bank while your brother jumps in is not the same as helping, and that it was written before someone gave up 2 years of their life, and their career deserves at least a conversation, hit that like button and subscribe. Because love is not just a feeling, it is a presence. And presence has a cost that should be seen, even when it cannot be fully repaid. #I carved my career for Dad.